Hey, I am here with Greg Gibbs, and we've kind of been discussing this whole journey of generosity, and this has been great. It's been a great discussion.
Really fun. I love the idea of you and I sitting down like this, because then it's like how we would talk on your back porch or whatever, but you prompt me with questions and I answer them, and hopefully it's helpful to Eastown.
Yeah, and there's a few segments, so if you've missed some of these, we'll make those available, but let's jump back in.
Do it.
All right. Let's start, Greg. Let's talk a little bit, because you are brilliant in this conversation when it comes to, I've actually used some of your stuff, and if it went over really, really well, I take credit.
I know.
And if it bombs, I was like, Greg Gibbs. Anyways, you kind of have developed this pathway. But before you do that, I want to do this, because I would say some of the people haven't grown up in church, haven't really had any type of religious background. But you and I had an amazing experience growing up in church. And there's a huge piece missing in a lot of people's development when it comes to church, and that is flannel graphs. And that is like little toy figures of Jesus and floating panthers.
Yeah.
But anyways, we're missing those things. But
the floating panthers were key to my discipleship as a child.
They were huge. But here's the thing. I actually have a point.
Yeah.
It's like, that's where it started.
Yeah,
like,
right,
that's where an understanding of who Jesus was and who God is. And, it's like you start with baby food with babies. You don't give them steak, right? It's like, talk a little bit about where do we start and how does that you make sense of whatever I'm asking.
Yeah, okay? No, I agree with you. So there's an advantage in a way, and we've had to deal with what it means to grow up in church in other ways that weren't an advantage. But
why are you laughing?
Well, it's not that funny. But I would say in both of our cases, your parents and mine were people that modeled generosity. And so a huge advantage for us is that we thought that was normal. We thought it was normal to give away your food and your home and your stuff, to be able to bless other people. So that wasn't like a big shift for like Andrea and I when we got married, because our parents did that as a part of their faith. So some people that are coming into the faith and all of a sudden they hear, wow, this is a new thing for me. That's a little more jolting than it would be for maybe you or I. So we do have that advantage. But here's the thing that it made me realize as I started to study this more, because we're so afraid of this topic for all the reasons we've cited already, we've tended to treat it almost like we don't want to talk about it that much. So we just say to people, look, just be generous, like go from 0 to 100. And we haven't given them a whole lot of help in terms of the steps to get to a life of generosity. As they mature in that, it takes a number of different maybe experimental steps. Like, I'm going to try this now and see how that works and see how that enhances my spiritual life and my devotion to God, things like that. Here's what I mean. Like when I was little and I was in church, they would teach me with flannel graphs or like big, thick Bible books that had cartoon characters of David and Goliath, right? And little words and lots of rhymes, because at that level of my stage of Christianity, I needed little words and lots of rhymes and big pictures. But as I grew into high school, I had youth pastors that would ask me to start to try to interpret Bible verses at a more complex level, right? But that's because I was ready for that stage, and I took other steps to get there. And then I eventually went on to study theology at a master's level, right? I didn't go from, big, thick Bible pages to systematic theology. There were a lot of steps along the way. Same thing with prayer, right? When I'm a little kid, my parents would teach me to fold my hands and say, "Dear Jesus, thank you for my Cheerios." Amen. And that was it, right? And then as I've grown in my faith, I can get much more intimate and deep and nuanced with my prayers to God. But there was a long time between baby prayers and big boy prayers, right?
Yeah.
Well, in money, we don't do that. We don't give anybody any sense of, hey, this isn't that easy, but walk with me and I'll show you how it's like to start to maybe live a life of where you're giving away your time and you're sacrificing some of your financial resources or your assets or whatever so that someone else can be blessed or so that God's kingdom can grow. We just like, okay, are you tithing? And who even knows what that means anymore in our culture, right? It's just kind of like a light switch. You're either not giving or you're giving generously, like flip it on. It's not a light switch. It's a process of growth, just like every other aspect of Christianity. And so my job, I feel like, when I'm hanging out with guys like you that have influence and are trying to lead people, is like, dude, walk people through it. Like, give them some steps where they're not just asking them to go from 0 to 100, But everybody, whether they've been following Jesus a long time, like you and I, or whether they are not even sure they're following Jesus yet, there's something they can try.
Yeah.
There's some next step. Like for Andrea and I, there's a next step for our generosity, even though we've been doing that for a while. We have to constantly think, okay, God, what is it that you want us to do now to show that we're not owned by money, but in fact we're owned by you in a sense, and that you've given us things that we should share?
It's so good. So I don't know how we do this in a short amount of time, but what are some of those, what would be a pathway for that? Or what would be stair steps to doing that?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know if we'll keep this in here or not, but there's part of us where I remember George Barna said, in most people's journey, spiritual journey, they don't go past the age of 8. It's like the adult playing in the kiddie pool with water wings on, not knowing that there's a deep end and that there's so much more to explore.
Yeah.
What keeps us, in that shallow end and saying, almost like a tipping when it comes to finances, and that is like, well, we've done our part, or we've done. And then another question I want to ask you, I know this is getting confusing, but why the church?
Yeah.
Can I just go and do this over there, or blah, blah, blah? So I don't know where we start with that, Greg. I threw a bunch at you.
It's
the
okay.
pathway, the staying at an 8-year-old place, and that type of thing.
Yeah, I think the way that I would start with it again is identifying the problem that I have, or that most of us have, which is everything about our culture and about what I've experienced with money teaches me to place my sense of significance, security, and satisfaction in how much money I have. I'm just going to pause right there, because if you're listening to this and you actually do a diagnostic on your own heart and soul, how much does your sense of security, significance, and satisfaction come from how much money you have or don't have? So if I'm banking on that resources to be where I'm going to get my identity or my sense of okayness, well, then giving it away or letting other people use my stuff is a threat to that. It's a threat to my sense of security. And believe me, I come from privilege, so I'm careful as to how I say these things, because for some people, they're at a level of resources that it literally is a threat to their security. Like the giving thing is a whole different ballgame, because they're barely making ends meet. They're barely feeding their children. But I would tell you that most of the people that I interact with in churches are maybe not at that level, and they're dealing with excess or surplus, or they're dealing with the ability to make some choices about their giving. So if you start there and you say, one of the reasons that I don't give is because of my fear of not having what I want, then I have to start to think, okay, well, what's the opposite of fear? It's courage, it's faith, it's saying the God that has provided all of this stuff to me so far is the same God that will continue to provide for me even when I give it away. So, at any given time in my money journey, I'm either operating in faith or I'm operating in fear. And so for us to start to take the steps, it's almost like we're trying to go from, crawling to walking to running to sprinting, whatever. And each one of those has its own new fear challenge, right? Mm-hmm. So for some people, it's just literally giving at all. That's their next step. And what we find in a lot of churches and even in a lot of Christian organizations, there's a lot of people that still don't give because of whatever reason. So maybe for some people, the step is just try it. For other people, because they've tried it and they're kind of erratic or sporadic with it, maybe their next step is consistent giving, like making it a discipline of life, just like
a rhythm.
A rhythm, just like you work out or you do other things that are rhythm, make giving a rhythm. Maybe there's another step for people that are like, okay, it's a rhythm, but I'm really not thinking about deep levels of giving, or I'm not even calculating things like what percentage of my income goes to the work of God in the world. Most people who claim Christianity in America give about 2% of their income away. So if that's the case, that means a lot of people listening to me are giving 2% of their income away. So I'm not trying to berate them or make fun of them or anything. I'm just saying, if you calculate that and it's 2%, okay, so try 3% this year, or 5 or 10 or 20, I don't know. But your step is probably to think about it more strategically. So if the first step is try it, the second step is make it more consistent. The third step is be a little bit more intentional, strategic about how much of what God has placed in your hands you give away. And then there's more steps. Maybe if someone's really consistent, maybe they're following the Christian practice of the tithe, which is a tenth or 10% or more of their income. Maybe there's another step. Maybe there's a going beyond the tithe, or maybe you give a tenth of your income to your church, but maybe you need to give another 5% to another work of God in the world that's not the church, that you believe in. I don't know. But these are all the ways where you're asking yourself the question on a regular basis, God, what's my next step?
Yeah.
Because I think we should be asking that in other categories. What's my next step in my relationships? What's my next step in my commitment to the church? What's my next step in my career? Whatever. All these next step questions are questions that thoughtful people ask about growth.
Yeah. No, I think that's so good. And I think for me, I go back to the beginning where you're talking about, I saw this modeled. Mm-hmm. So there's a danger in, hey, I saw this modeled, so this is just what I do. Mm-hmm. And never go back to the question and saying, okay, because I do believe, and I think I heard you say this, God does have an opinion when it comes to our generosity and finances. What is the next step for Michael and I? What is the next, how do we be intentional, more intentional, and with that?